What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. I'm so excited to be doing this one with you because we are continuing our 8-day series, 8 days in the Beatitudes, where each and every day we talk about one of the 8 Beatitudes that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5. Today we're on day, I believe it's 3. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, when we think of meekness, right, what do we typically think of, right? When we think of meekness, we probably think of like weakness, right? Meekness and weakness, we seem to kind of put them hand in hand, right? Maybe it's a weak person kind of being a pushover, right? Maybe somebody that's soft and can't stand up for themselves. But what happens in this verse, right, in Matthew, I think it's 5:5. Yes, Matthew 5:5. Jesus flips that. He flips the definition of meekness. You see, I used to personally think that to be meek meant being weak, right? Somebody that shrinks back at anything that's bigger than itself. But Jesus shows that meekness is not being somebody that shrinks back, but instead it's somebody who's actually able to control their strength. So Jesus shows that it's not about shrinking back, but Jesus shows that meekness is actually about strength under control. Now, I want to frame kind of the main question of today's video, right? What does it mean to be meek? And why would God promise the meek people an inheritance as big as the earth? Now, in Matthew 5, verse 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Right? And each and every beatitude kind of builds on the last, right? And I love that because Jesus frames it so well. So first day, obviously, the first beatitude was, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So we talk about poverty in spirit and what it means to actually depend upon God. So dependence instead of just pretending, right? Then the second day, yesterday, was mourning, right? What does it mean to mourn and how are we comforted in the middle of our mourning? And so now we're talking about meekness and actually how we are designed and called to be meek so that we can inherit the earth, right? And one of the misconceptions, like I was talking about the meek, is that meek equals weak or passive or timid, but that's not the case, right? Meekness is not being passive or timid or afraid, but the biblical definition of meekness is controlled strength, humility, and being greatly empowered by God, right? And more so, gentleness empowered by God, right? The biblical definition of meekness is gentleness empowered by God. And what does that even mean? Well, I want you to think of kind of like a stallion or like a horse, right? They're big and mighty and they're muscular and they're just powerful, right? But yet they're often tamed by its master. Why? Because they submit. Even though they know, right, they could by all means overpower a human master if they really wanted to. They submit out of reverence and respect for the master, right? Because it provides, like the master provides for the horse, and so out of respect and gratitude for the master, the horse surrenders, right? Even though it's more powerful, even though it's bigger than the human, the horse surrenders. Now, I'm not saying that we're bigger and more mighty than God. That's absolutely not. But what I am saying is that even in our strength, we are still called to submit to God. And so that's kind of what we can see as a cross-reference in Psalm 37:11, like, "But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." That's Psalm 37, verse 11. And I think when we look at meekness, we typically see models that are the antithesis of meekness, right? Like we're talking about, when we see meekness, we see weakness. But when we truly see meekness is in Jesus. How do we see Jesus being meek? Well, Jesus described himself as being gentle and lowly in heart in Matthew 11:29. And then at his trial, right, when he was in trial against the Pharisees and they were falsely accusing him and testifying against him, he had all right. He had the power to call upon legions of angels and they would come and swoop him up at the drop of a hat and a snap of a finger at a single heartbeat. Yet out of silence and submission, he submitted to God and submitted to the Pharisees. Why would he submit to the Pharisees? Well, because by submitting to the Pharisees, he was submitting to God. And by submitting to God, he allowed the will of God to be done in his life. And so here we are, saved and just retransformed because of the submission of Christ, right? The cross is the ultimate visual. It is the ultimate picture of what it means to be meek. It's having the strength to defend yourself. It is having the strength to prove your point. It is having the strength to glorify yourself, but choosing to surrender it to God. Why? Because you respect the will of God. Meekness is not the absence of power. It is the surrender of power. And in our culture today, right, we celebrate dominance, right? We celebrate power. We celebrate these controls and these clapbacks that we can clock somebody's team, right? But human pride also wants to win arguments. It wants to prove ourselves. It wants to fight back whenever our reputation is at stake, whenever our reputation is about to be, just ruined and shredded. But meekness calls us to yield to God instead of defending ourselves at all costs. What does that look like? When was the last time you held back from proving yourself or proving your point just to honor God? Right? We get so caught up in clocking somebody's tea. We get so caught up in winning the argument and seeming like we're the smartest in the room and seeming like, I got it all together and you don't. That what happens is we are actually pulling the wrath of God towards us whenever we engage in bickering and arguing and just trying to prove a point that we don't really need to be proving. That's what happens. And so again, I encourage you, remind yourself that you don't have to prove a point to another person because your heart has already been shown by God. Now, some things you have to defend, right? And that's perfectly okay. When you're defending your faith and what you defend, is objective truth, especially when it's about Jesus. That is one thing to defend. But when you're just defending a reputation, especially if it's constructive criticism, constructive criticism is not judgment. I see this all the time. People will say, especially the unbeliever, when you give them constructive criticism about their lifestyle, let's say, hey man, look, it's probably not the best idea for you to be smoking, man. I wouldn't be smoking if I were you. Or man, I probably wouldn't go have sex with that girl if I were you, bro. Or man, I would stop cussing people online like you do, bro. I would stop. A lot of people, especially in today's world, they'll say that you're judging them. Oh, who are you to judge me? You're a sinner too. You sin too, right? Yes, I do. And because out of my insight of how sin affected my life, I'm able to tell you that your sin is going to affect you in a similar, if not worse way. It's not judgment. In fact, we're actually told in Matthew to judge righteously. So we are given the authority to judge, just not in the same way that God judges people, right? Judge to the measure in which you will be judged, right? So if I'm judging somebody, this is not out of a place of condemnation. It is out of a place of constructive criticism and observation, right? And so that is one of the things that we can kind of attest to whenever we're supposed to be meek. We can defend that and we can guide people towards righteousness and towards repentance. But if that's being done to us, then we're still called to be meek, right? Not to defend ourselves and be like, oh, you can't be judging me. You're a sinner too. We can't be doing that, right? We have to be meek, and that's what Jesus calls us to. Now, when we look at the full verse of Matthew 5, verse 5, we are told to be meek, right? Blessed are the meek. But then we are also promised an inheritance, right? Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And inherit the earth actually echoes in Psalm 37. I want to encourage you to go read it. And it is rooted in the Old Testament promise, right? And there's two layers to this promise. There's the present, which is inner peace. There's freedom from pride. There's deeper relationships. That's the present, right? When we are meek, we are promised inner peace. We are promised freedom from our pride, from our sin, and we are promised deeper relationships. We're better relationships with God, better relationships with other people. We are overflowing our love for other people and God as a byproduct of our meekness and submission to God. And then there's a future promise. That's the second layer, right? When we are meek, one of the promises that we will inherit is eternal inheritance, right? Reigning with Christ in the new heaven and the new earth. And that's in Revelation 21. And so the whole theme here is that the proud, they try and grasp on all these inheritances. They try and grasp on to inner peace and freedom from pride and blah, blah, blah. But little do they know that they lose because they're too prideful. Everything that comes their way, they make it about them and they self-deify their own self. But the meek, when they surrender, they gain. And so what are the ways we can practice meekness? How can we actually practice meekness in our lives? Well, the first one is to yield to God daily, right? It's praying, it's not my will, but your will be done. And that's a hard prayer to pray because that means that even in the bad times when we're called to actually go through the fire and go walk through the thorns and just endure that pain, we have to be okay with it. It's not necessarily that it's a good thing, but it produces good, right? And so we have to be able to surrender our will and say, God, it's not my will, but your will. What else can we do to practice meekness? We can practice humility, right? We have to be able to admit our wrongs. One of the things that we do in our modern day culture is we will do anything but admit that we're wrong. We will do anything just to clock somebody else's teeth, except admitting that we're wrong and admitting that we can improve. What we'll do is we'll just try and we'll do everything under the sun to avoid being wrong. But Jesus says, no, you have to be able to admit when you're wrong quickly. It's to apologize. It's to give away credit, right? Stop trying to take it all for yourself. Naturally, it's okay to take some credit. Like if you've done something, it's okay, but you don't have to make it all about you. You can acknowledge that you did that thing. You can acknowledge that you got this achievement, you got this accolade, you did this thing for somebody or whatever it is. You can acknowledge that, but you don't have to make it all about you, right? You don't have to think that people are going to throw roses at your feet because you did this. No, you can just acknowledge that you did it, but you don't have to have people throw roses at your feet. Secondly, or next, serve quietly. And this ties back into my last one. When we serve quietly, we're not seeking attention for our good deeds. When we serve quietly, what happens is we can actually do the good works that God calls us to do. We can be rewarded for them by God himself. We don't need the approval of man. We don't need the approval of, our friends, our family, our colleagues. We don't need the approval of Instagram Reels and TikTok and YouTube. Like, we don't need that. It's good to spread awareness. It's not good to seek attention. Now, we can also respond gently. And we read that in Proverbs 15, verse 1. It says, a gentle answer turns away wrath. Again, when we're too busy trying to clock somebody's teeth, we're trying to one-up them, we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? We're turning the wrath of God upon ourselves. A gentle answer, just admitting when we're wrong, or even just not really defending yourself and just loving that person regardless of what they're saying about you. A gentle answer turns away the wrath of God, and it turns his love and the other person's love towards yourself, right? So I just want you to reflect on this moment. Like, where in your life do you still feel the need to control instead of surrendering to God? Like, search deep in your heart, like, where in my life am I seeking control instead of surrenderance? Right? We have to be able to trust God with the outcomes, right? When you're meek, it releases control of the outcomes. It's okay to want the positive outcomes. Like for me personally, like I want to build this channel. I want to build my Instagram funnels because I want a bigger audience and I want to be able to do evangelistic work full time. And so I want to be able to just do this full time. Like that's the outcome I want. I want this to be a full-time job for me. So I don't have to worry about finances, but I can fully pour myself into this. That's an outcome. I want to be able to speak in conferences. I want to be able to speak to large congregations. That's an outcome. Those are not bad outcomes, but I have to be able to trust God with the outcome. So whether that comes or whether that goes, I have to be able to trust God and release that to him. So saying, God, even if I don't fulfill my dream of ever, making this YouTube channel big or, my Instagram channel big or ever speaking at a convocation or, a conference or anything like that, like all these dreams, I can have them. But if that's not what you want for my life, that's fine. I trust what you were doing. But that's hard because that means that the dreams we may have, it's not the plan that God has for us. But that is meekness. It is full surrenderance and being okay. How can we even do that? It's because we trust in the goodness that God has. We trust in the goodness that God is. And we even trust in the goodness that God was. Past, present, future. So I just want to restate that meekness is not weakness. It is God-controlled strength. You see, the meek often tend to look like they're losing. When we're meek, we look like we're losing, but in Christ, we inherit everything. So I want to challenge you to be meek this week, right? Choose one situation this week and just practice meekness in the middle of that, right? Whether it's at work or at school or your families or online, whatever it is, find an area and practice being meek actively. Do that this week, and I promise you might see some fruit from it. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so excited that you stuck around for this one. I can't wait for tomorrow, which is day 4. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We're going to be talking about what it means to hunger and thirst for righteousness and how we will actually be satisfied if we do that. So follow me on Instagram, subscribe, do all those things. We're trying to build an audience. We're trying to push out the word of God to all places, on all platforms, and eventually make this ministry full time. That is the goal. And of course, we talked about trusting God with the outcomes. So we're going to do that. Just make sure you subscribe. Follow me on Instagram if you enjoy the content. So excited you watched all the way to the end. Thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow in the next one. Peace.